Diddy's freak-offs have been the subject of wild rumors for years.
But I make no excuses.
But as more details surface, the truth behind these events turns out to be more bizarre than most could imagine. These multi-day parties weren't just celebrity gatherings. They pushed boundaries of legality, morality, and basic human decency. Here are 10 of the weirdest and most unsettling facts about Diddy's infamous freak-offs, which left many participants and insiders shaken. 1. The parties lasted for days and participants were pushed to their physical limits. Diddy's freak-offs weren't your typical one-night celebrity parties. These events often lasted for several days, during which guests were expected to keep the energy going non-stop. It wasn't just about partying hard. These marathons were designed to break people down. Drugs, alcohol, and physical exhaustion would push participants to their limits, often leading to bizarre, out-of-control behavior. Many attendees reportedly found themselves in a state of delirium by the second or third day, unsure of what was happening around them. These prolonged sessions created an atmosphere of chaos and disorientation, where reality blurred and things quickly spiraled into the extreme. To keep guests going during these multi-day benders, Diddy reportedly had medical professionals on standby with IV drips. Participants who were too drugged or exhausted were hooked up to intravenous fluids to rehydrate them and allow them to continue. The sight of people sprawled out receiving IVs only to jump back into the party was not uncommon. It added an eerie, almost dystopian element to the proceedings, where even the body's natural signals of fatigue and pain were overridden to maintain the freak-off momentum. 2. The baby oil and lubricant obsession. One of the most bizarre details of Diddy's freak-offs is the sheer amount of baby oil and lubricant involved. Guests at these events were reportedly covered in baby oil as part of elaborate sexual performances that took place in front of large crowds. It became a symbol of the freak-offs, making the parties feel more like staged orgies than spontaneous gatherings. When authorities raided Diddy's properties in 2024, they uncovered over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. This wasn't just a random party prop, it was a crucial element in the debauchery that unfolded. The sight of baby oil-slicked bodies participating in what some have described as choreographed sex acts is one of the defining images of these freak-offs. The volume of oil used created an unsettling, almost surreal atmosphere, turning the parties into something more reminiscent of a bizarre underground show than a typical Hollywood bash. Witnesses described the sensation of being covered in oil and the way it heightened the strange, dehumanizing nature of the events. 3. Sex acts were orchestrated like performances. The freak-offs weren't spontaneous hookups or drunken flings. They were highly organized events where sex acts were not only encouraged, but choreographed. Diddy reportedly directed these encounters like a twisted director on a film set. Multiple participants would be involved in these performances, with Diddy deciding who did what and when. The guests were often drugged and coerced into participating in acts they might not have otherwise agreed to, creating an environment where boundaries were crossed on a regular basis. These acts were more than just the result of a wild night. They were arranged and planned with specific roles for each participant. Witnesses reported that Diddy would not only direct these performances, but also record them. Some claimed that the recordings were made without the participants' consent and were later used as blackmail, ensuring that no one would speak out about what they experienced. This orchestrated nature turned the freak-offs into something far more predatory than your typical party. 4. The availability of drugs was out of control. The availability of drugs at Diddy's freak-offs went far beyond the occasional joint or line of coke. Guests had access to a wide range of controlled substances, including cocaine, MDMA, ketamine, GHB, and other hallucinogens. The drugs weren't just there to enhance the party, They were reportedly used to push participants into increasingly extreme and sometimes dangerous sexual activities. Guests were often pressured to partake, creating a dark atmosphere of coercion where sobriety was barely an option. The presence of these drugs played a critical role in the breakdown of inhibitions and the crossing of boundaries. Sources claimed that guests would often become so intoxicated that they lost the ability to consent or even fully comprehend what was happening around them. The drugs kept people locked in a cycle of partying and submission where leaving or saying no became nearly impossible. This created an environment that was as dangerous as it was indulgent. 5. Consent was a murky area at best. One of the darkest aspects of Diddy's freak-offs was the blurred lines of consent. Many attendees reported that they were too intoxicated to give proper consent during the sexual encounters that took place. Drugs and alcohol were freely distributed, and guests often found themselves pressured into participating in acts they didn't agree to beforehand. Some participants later described feeling trapped in a situation where they couldn't easily escape, making the freak-offs feel more like coercive environments than freewheeling parties. The power dynamics at play in these events were also a major concern. Diddy was known for using his influence over guests, many of whom were aspiring artists or models, promising them career opportunities in exchange for their participation. In this sense, the freak-offs became less about mutual enjoyment and more about exploitation, where people felt compelled to take part out of fear that their refusal could damage their careers. 6. Secret recordings were made without consent. Perhaps one of the most shocking revelations about Diddy's freak-offs is that much of what happened was secretly recorded. Hidden cameras were reportedly placed throughout the venues, capturing the sexual acts and drug use that took place. These recordings were made without the participants' knowledge or consent, turning their private experiences into potential blackmail material. Diddy is said to have kept this footage as a form of leverage, using it to control the people who attended and ensure their silence. The existence of these recordings raises serious ethical and legal concerns. Many of the guests at these freak-offs were unaware that their most intimate moments were being captured on film. The knowledge that these tapes existed created an atmosphere of paranoia where attendees feared that anything they did could be used against them later. It wasn't just about the parties anymore, it was about the long-lasting consequences of being involved. 7. Diddy's employees were deeply involved. Diddy didn't run the freak-offs on his own. His employees were reportedly involved in every aspect of the events, from booking hotel rooms to ensuring the venues were stocked with drugs, baby oil, and other party essentials. These workers were tasked with preparing the rooms before the parties and cleaning up afterward, ensuring that no evidence of what had taken place was left behind. This level of involvement made the freak-offs feel less like spontaneous parties and more like planned operations. In some cases, employees were also responsible for managing the guests, making sure they adhered to Diddy's rules. This included ensuring that everyone who attended handed over their phones and signed non-disclosure agreements. By controlling the flow of information and keeping the details of the freak-offs hidden, Diddy's team played a key role in maintaining the secrecy around these events. 8. IV drips were used to keep the party going. As if the drugs and sex weren't extreme enough, one of the weirdest aspects of the freak-offs was the use of IV drips to help guests recover. With people taking drugs like MDMA and GHB, their bodies would often become dehydrated and exhausted after hours or days of partying. To combat this, Diddy reportedly had medical professionals or hired staff on hand to administer IV fluids to guests. This allowed them to rehydrate and recover enough to continue partying. The use of IV drips added an unsettling, almost dystopian element to the parties. It wasn't just about having fun anymore. It became about pushing the human body beyond its natural limits. Guests would collapse from exhaustion, only to be revived and sent back into the chaos. This practice turned the freak-offs into something closer to a gladiatorial arena than a party where the goal was to keep going at all costs. 9. Secluded locations created a sense of isolation. Diddy's freak-offs weren't held in regular clubs or party venues. These events often took place in secluded, highly private locations where guests were cut off from the outside world. One of the most infamous locations was Diddy's private island in the Caribbean, where guests would be flown in for multi-day parties. Once there, they were required to hand over their phones and sign strict non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that no one could document or share what happened. The isolation of these locations made the parties feel even more intense. With no connection to the outside world, guests were effectively trapped in a bubble where anything could happen. This sense of isolation made it difficult for people to leave or seek help if things went too far. It also created a power dynamic where Diddy had total control over what happened and who stayed. 10. The aftermath was cleaned up by Diddy's team. After each freak-off, Diddy's employees were reportedly responsible for meticulously cleaning up the aftermath. These workers would go into the hotel rooms or private locations used for the events and remove all traces of what had occurred. This included wiping down surfaces, removing drugs, disposing of any physical evidence, and restoring the room to its original condition. The aim was to ensure that nothing from the wild party could be traced back to Diddy or his guests, keeping everything under wraps. The cleanup process didn't just involve the physical mess, but also covering up the emotional and psychological aftermath of the parties. Many guests left the freak-offs feeling drained, confused, or regretful, but they were expected to remain silent. Diddy's team played a key role in controlling the narrative, ensuring that no details about the events ever leaked to the public. By keeping everything tightly controlled, Diddy maintained a cloak of secrecy around these bizarre and often disturbing parties. Diddy's freak-offs weren't just parties. They were events that pushed boundaries, blurred lines of consent, and left behind an unsettling legacy of control and secrecy. From gallons of baby oil to multi-day marathons fueled by drugs and coercion, these parties revealed a dark side to the music mogul's world. With employees cleaning up the physical and emotional aftermath, the freak-offs were hidden behind layers of secrecy and intimidation. As more details continue to emerge, the true nature of these events paints a troubling picture of power gone unchecked.